Hotbed Talk. So, Seamus O'Mahony.
As you can imagine, a gastroenterologist coming to speak to a group of intensivists generally is a feeling of trepidation, but I do feel a bit of a graw for this meeting. I last came here 6 years ago. I was the second last speaker on the Saturday morning session and addressed an audience of, I think, less than a dozen. My talk had the rather unwieldy title of Tame Death, Wild Death from Montaigne to Mid-Staffordshire. Catchy. I had put quite a bit of preparation into this talk and thought, well, I might write a paper about it. And when I sat down to write, I soon realised that it would have to be a book and that it would have to be for a general readership. And as Brian said, the result was this book, which to my surprise was published. So the publishers asked me to do a follow-up, which I did, and this talk really takes some of the themes from this book which came out earlier this year. Now, in the very first episode of The Sopranos, by the way, the greatest television programme ever made, you'll all agree, Tony Soprano expressed regret that he had missed the mafia's best years. I feel a similar regret about the timing of my career in medicine. I qualified in 1983. I'm the one on the left, by the way. And so here I am, head full of hair, heart full of hope. I graduated towards the end of what I have arbitrarily defined as medicine's golden age, a period which I think lasted from the mid-1930s to the mid-1980s. My very first paper at a major medical conference was at the British Society of Gastroenterology in 1987. And this meeting marked the 50th anniversary of the foundation of the Society. Every delegate was given a copy of this book here, which contained a selection of the most influential papers published in gastroenterology over that half-century. And the introduction to the book was written by Sir Francis Avery Jones, by common consent, the father of British gastroenterology, the grandest of the grandees. He was present at the very first meeting, which was a dinner at the Langham Hotel in London. 36 founding members, all men, and he was the guest of honour at this Jubilee meeting in 1987. So, in that 50 years, Sir Francis had witnessed the arrival of antibiotics, effective treatment for tuberculosis, the antipsychotics which transformed psychiatry, polio, which caused a huge epidemic in my native city, became preventable by vaccination. The WHO announced the eradication of smallpox in 1980. Organ transplantation has had a much smaller impact on population health than vaccination, but was seen by the general public as one of the great triumphs of scientific medicine. There was the discovery of the Double Helix in the early 50s. Endoscopy arrived in the late 50s, flexible endoscopy. Cardiac bypass surgery in the early 60s. CT scanning, ultrasound, MRI in the 70s. Patrick Steptoe, an obstetrician working in a district general hospital in Oldham, developed IVF in the late 70s. And this was typical of many of the breakthroughs of this golden age. They were achieved by individual clinicians like Steptoe, who were working outside big research centres and universities. So this golden age was a sort of once-off in human history, a unique confluence of science, serendipity, and events. And we tend to forget what life and medicine was like before the golden age changed everything. This is a photo taken of my mother's family in 1945. The occasion was the final profession of my aunt, Julia, as a Loreto nun. She died last year at the age of 94. My mother's here, aged about 13. 2 years before this picture was taken, she had been gravely ill with pneumonia. And she survived, I think, mainly because she was given sulfapyridine, which was one of the earliest antibacterial drugs, known colloquially as M&B tablets after the manufacturer May and Baker. At the back here is the youngest son, Billy, who was 17 at the time. He died a year after this photograph was taken of spinal tuberculosis. He died at home because medicine had absolutely nothing to offer. Less than 2 years after Billy's death, the British Medical Journal published the very first ever randomised controlled trial, the first RCT in anything. And this trial proved beyond any doubt that streptomycin was effective against tuberculosis. The trial was designed by the great medical statistician Austin Bradford Hill, and it was run and funded by the Medical Research Council. Hill himself had been invalided out of the RAF during the First World War with pulmonary tuberculosis, and he had to forego his ambition to study medicine and became a statistician instead. And he thus, by being a statistician, contributed far more to global population health than he ever would have done as a doctor. There was a dramatic rise in life expectancy during this golden age, but this rise had begun some decades actually before the mid-1930s. And similarly, there was a dramatic fall in infant mortality. Many have pointed out that a lot of this was due to factors outside of medicine. But nevertheless, there was a confidence that the same dramatic rate of progress in medicine and health would continue indefinitely. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with him, the man in the skipping rope here is the late Professor Rishtard Mulcahy. He was a very prominent Irish cardiologist, worked at St. Vincent's Hospital in Dublin. And he's shown here engaged in a bit of awareness raising for the Irish Heart Foundation. And in 1987, he gave an interview to the Irish Times and confidently predicted that by 2000, heart disease, stroke, respiratory disease and cancer would be wiped out. And as we know, this hasn't happened. Since the 1980s, there certainly has been progress, some of it indeed dramatic. But when compared to the triumphs of the Golden Age, progress in my professional lifetime has been more incremental compared to that 50 years. And many would say that most of the low-hanging fruit, to use that awful cliché, was picked during the Golden Age. Dissenting voices within medicine were rare during the Golden Age, but one such dissenting voice was this guy, Macfarlane Burnet, Sir Macfarlane Burnet. He was an Australian Nobel Prize-winning virologist and immunologist. He caused a sensation in the early 70s with his book Genes, Dreams and Realities, and he argued in this book that the diseases of the future would be those of old age and degeneration, and that these diseases would not be conquered like the infectious diseases were during the golden age of medicine. He shared the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1960 with the great immunologist Sir Peter Medawar, and they won the prize for their work in tissue grafting and the discovery of acquired immunological tolerance, and this paved the way for organ transplantation. Medawar was appalled by Burnet's book. And some years after it came out, he wrote a piece for the New York Review of Books, a very prestigious literary journal, in 1980. And he predicted that within a decade, multiple sclerosis, diabetes, and 2 common cancers would be cured. And history, as we know, sided with Burnet. So, one of the major consequences of the Golden Age, and sort of the theme of my book, was the emergence of the medical industrial complex. And this industrial complex has many stakeholders, typically pharma, medical devices manufacturers, insurance companies, pharmacy sector. The one thing that I've noticed, having been to a conference on gluten-free produce, is that the sales of these free-from health foods are growing at an exponential rate. Industrialized research, which has been called big science, scientific publishers. The big tech companies are investing heavily in healthcare. The British NHS, as many of you know here, has provided rich pickings for investors through PFI schemes. And health provides a lot of work for lobbyists and management consultants and secondary professionals. And as we've seen in this country in particular, medical education is now big business. So the intellectual motor of this medical industrial complex is scientific research. And the production of this research doubles every 9 years. So it has grown fairly exponentially in my professional lifetime. And all of this research has to go somewhere, and that somewhere is a journal. So for those of you who are too young to be familiar with this man, Robert Maxwell, he was a Czech-born business tycoon who famously emptied the pension fund of the Daily Mirror workers, and he died in very mysterious circumstances in the early 90s, falling off his yacht. He made his first fortune in medical scientific publishing. In the early 50s, he saw that this was going to be extremely popular, and he set up a company called Pergamon. And he hit on the simple but brilliant idea of persuading prominent medical academics that their particular discipline needed a new journal. So he would fly these medical academics in, often by Concorde, into his Oxfordshire mansion, wine and dine them, and install them as the editors of these new journals. He called scientific publishing a perpetual financing machine with a unique business model. The product, which is scientific papers, is given to the publishers for free. Other researchers do the editing and reviewing for free, and the purchasers of the product are mainly government-funded institutes and universities. It is a bizarre triple-pay system in which the state funds most of the research, pays the salaries of most of the people doing it, and then buys most of the finished product. Maxwell knew that university libraries would subscribe to every new journal they produced, he produced, which they did. So, in terms of size, medical scientific publishing is somewhere between the music industry and the film industry, but where it beats them hands down is the profit margins. So, Elsevier, which is probably the largest medical publisher, has a profit of 40% on turnover, vastly greater than other industries such as car manufacture. I think Robert Maxwell would have admired the pure shamelessness of the predatory journals, which emerged about 10 years ago to meet the need of researchers to publish their work. As you know, predatory journals will publish anything as long as you pay. And their number has risen exponentially since about 2010, and they're now thought to be somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 of these journals. And I presume, like me, many of you get emails from them on a daily basis asking you to contribute or to join their editorial board. And more recently, we've seen the emergence of predatory medical conferences. Researchers nowadays are under intense career pressure and are incentivized to value quantity over quality, to produce data rather than original ideas. The biophysicist John Platt encapsulated this problem way back in the 1960s in a paper he wrote for Science called Strong Inference. And he wrote, "We speak piously of taking measurements and making small studies that will add another brick to the temple of science. Most of these bricks just lie around in the brickyard." The late, great Douglas Altman, the medical statistician, wrote a famous editorial for the British Medical Journal in 1994 called The Scandal of Poor Medical Research. In 2015, the BMJ held a poll of their readers on which paper the journal should be most proud of publishing over the previous 25 years, and this paper won by a landslide. Altman simply articulated clearly and concisely what everyone within the medicine knew, which was that much poor research arises because researchers feel compelled, for career reasons, to carry out research they're ill-equipped to perform, and nobody stops them. Altman anticipated what has come to be known as the replication crisis. And this is the indisputable fact that most research findings are never repeated or replicated to confirm that they're real. In 2015, a symposium on this crisis was held in London under the collective auspices of the Academy of Medical Sciences, the Wellcome Trust, the Medical Research Council, and the Biotechnology and Biological Sciences Research Council. The report produced from this meeting, which I strongly urge you to read, it concluded that there was no single cause for this crisis. The factors they identified included journals' well-known bias for positive studies, p-hacking or data dredging, often called data torture, where raw data are run through multiple statistical tests until a significant result is found. A theoretical physicist contributed to this symposium and told the medical researchers gathered that the p-value of 0.05, which is thought to be acceptable in medical research, would be laughed out the door in physics. Harking, or hypothesizing after the results are known, weak experimental design, including lack of statistical power. But the most important factor they identified was what they called cultural. Researchers now work in such a highly competitive environment where there is intense pressure to publish, often and in high-impact journals. And big science is driven by multiple perverse incentives, particularly by publication metrics, citation count, H-index, and so on. And these incentives have had particular consequences on what could be called the ecology of scientific communities. This brilliant paper came out in the Royal Society's journal Open Science, and it's called The Natural Selection of Bad Science. The authors are Paul Smaldino, a cognitive scientist, and Richard McElreath, a behavioural scientist. And they used a Darwinian evolutionary model to explain how bad science has prospered. They showed how the highly competitive culture of contemporary research has led to what they call bad science, with low statistical power, small sample sizes, and an emphasis on the novel and the sensational. And they argue that Darwinian natural selection of high-volume published output spreads this bad science because successful labs produce more progeny and who start labs of their own. An editorial in The Lancet on the replication crisis concluded that something has gone fundamentally wrong with one of our greatest human creations. Some of you may be familiar with John Ioannidis. He's a Greek-American meta-researcher. A meta-researcher is somebody who does research about research. Ioannidis was a maths prodigy as a child in Athens. He trained as an epidemiologist during the heyday of evidence-based medicine in the early 90s, and he is now professor of medicine at Stanford. He has been critically appraising medical research for nearly 2 decades. His 2005 paper, Why Most Published Research Findings Are False, is the most cited paper ever published by PLOS Medicine. Ioannidis was the first to really get to grips with the replication crisis, and he identified the causes which I've listed. Every bit of the process, he found, was riddled with error and logical fallacy. Most clinical trials asked the wrong questions, recruited too few patients, and those they recruited were often atypical and unrepresentative. They analysed the data incorrectly and they came to the wrong conclusions. A 2009 paper in The Lancet came to similar conclusions, and this paper was written by Ian Chalmers and Paul Glaziou, 2 leaders in evidence-based medicine. They came up with a figure of a wastage of 85% of medical research, and they identified 3 causes of waste. First, incomplete reporting. Half of all registered trials are never published in full. Second, poor reporting. Half of all published trials are not sufficiently clear, complete, or accurate enough for others to use. And poor design. Half of all new studies do not take systematic account of lessons from previous research. And they came up with a figure of an annual waste of $170 billion. And they used the analogy of a transport business where half the goods are badly designed, half are lost in shipping, and half of the remainder are broken by the time they arrive. John Ioannidis has coined the phrase the medical misinformation mess to encompass all of these problems. And this mess has 4 components. Much published research is unreliable, offers no benefit to patients, and is not useful to decision makers. Most doctors are unaware of this. Even if they are aware, they lack the skills to critically evaluate the evidence. And patients and families often struggle to access good evidence and skilled guidance at the time of medical decision making. But hang on, wasn't evidence-based medicine support to sort all of this out? Wasn't it meant to combine the best research evidence with clinical expertise and the patient's values? Is this really happening? The late David Sackett of McMaster University in Canada is regarded as one of the founding fathers of evidence-based medicine. The actual term evidence-based medicine was coined in 1991 by another McMaster physician, Gordon Guyatt. The doctors in McMaster didn't exactly discourage the belief that they had somehow invented evidence-based medicine, but all they really did was to repackage and give a catchy title to long-established ideas on trial design, statistics, and scientific integrity. There was nothing new or magical about all of this. Austin Bradford Hill led the way in the 1940s, and Archie Cochrane in the 1960s and 70s. Archie Cochrane has been honoured by the Cochrane collaboration. Cochrane, as you know, was a famous epidemiologist. He was a pupil of Austin Bradford Hill. He wrote a short book in the early 70s called Effectiveness and Efficiency, and this became an unexpected bestseller. And in this book, Cochrane argued that the NHS should take evidence from only randomised controlled trials to identify which treatments work. He believed that only treatments of proven effectiveness should be offered by the NHS, and that all such treatments should be costed and delivered equitably. John Ioannidis looked up to David Sackett as his mentor and guide. Sackett died in 2015, and a year after his death, Ioannidis wrote a paper for the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology. And this paper was in the form of a personal letter to David Sackett called How Evidence-Based Medicine Has Been Hijacked. In this paper, Ioannidis argued that 3/4 of trials published in the top 4 major general medical journals like the New England, JAMA and the Lancet and so on are funded by industry. And if pharma is paying for the evidence, it is hardly surprising if the evidence it produces shows its product in the best possible light. Similarly for meta-analysis and guidelines. And Ioannidis concluded in this paper, in this personal letter, that the scientific ideals behind evidence-based medicine are noble, but haven't been realised. Ben Goldacre's 2012 book, Bad Pharma, is a detailed and eloquent explanation of the mechanics of this hijacking and how both the medical profession and their patients have been duped. A particularly egregious example to my mind is the use of surrogate and often meaningless outcomes in cancer trials, particularly progression-free survival. And even the oncology community themselves are questioning this. This is a paper from a Canadian cancer trials group back in 2012 where they openly questioned this commonly used endpoint of progression-free survival, which is now used in all sorts of cancer trials and commonly used by pharma to get new drugs approved. Jeremy Howick is a philosopher of science who works at the Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine in Oxford. He agreed with John Ioannidis and Ben Goldacre that evidence-based medicine had indeed been hijacked, but he argued, again like Ioannidis and Goldacre, that the hijacking does not invalidate the methodology and the science. He argued that if we made medical decisions, for example, on the basis of reading palms, that vested interests would learn how to influence palm readers. Clinical doctors like me know that very often in our daily practice we don't have great evidence for what we do. And the BMJ produced a project in 2015 called Clinical Evidence. They looked at 3,000 treatments and tests. They found good evidence for effectiveness in just over a third. 15% were deemed to be actively harmful, and in 50% there was no good evidence of effectiveness one way or the other. And this comes as no surprise at all to those of us who work as full-time clinicians. We know that medicine is messy and imprecise and uncertain. And while we clinical foot soldiers struggle on, our academic leaders tell us that another golden age is around the corner, driven by genomics, precision medicine, and digital health. The completion of a rough draft of the Human Genome Project was announced at the White House in 2000 by Bill Clinton. He was joined by Tony Blair. You can just see him in the background here on a satellite link. There's Tony. And there were two rival genome projects. One was an international public consortium led by the American geneticist Francis Collins, and the other was a private company, Celera, led by Craig Venter. Clinton declared that the Human Genome Project would revolutionise the diagnosis, prevention and treatment of all human diseases. Tony Blair, who had always struggled a little with science and technology, piously agreed it's almost too awesome to fully comprehend. In the following year, 2001, Francis Collins predicted in an article for JAMA that by 2020, new gene-based designer drugs would be introduced for diabetes, hypertension and mental illness, every tumour with a precise molecular fingerprint. So 2020 is just around the corner. We're still waiting. By 2009, Collins was less bellicose and conceded that it is fair to say that the Human Genome Project has not yet directly affected the healthcare of most individuals. This is Harold Varmus, Nobel laureate, doyen of American cancer researchers, former director of the NIH. He told the New York Times in 2010, the clinical applications of the project have been modest, very modest compared to the resources invested. Genomics is a way to do science, not medicine. Similarly, Robert Weinberg of MIT, one of the founders of molecular oncology, the man who discovered the RAS oncogene. 2014, he wrote a semi-confessional essay for the journal Cell, in which he reflected on his long career in cancer biology. He wrote, "The data that we now generate overwhelm our abilities of interpretation, and the new discipline of systems biology has produced few insights into cancer biology." He concluded, "We can't assimilate and interpret most of the data that we accumulate. How will this play out? I wouldn't pretend to know." Digital health is very modish at the moment, with many strands like apps and consumer wearables and so on. And one of the striking things for me is the vocabulary of digital health, with words like empowering, connecting, communities, disruption. And this is the very same rhetoric of Silicon Valley, and it's no great surprise that the tech giants are investing heavily in digital health. What's wrong with that, you might ask? I would argue that digital health is simply one part of what has now been called surveillance capitalism. This phrase was coined by my hero, Shoshana Zuboff, who is professor at the Harvard Business School. Her book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, came out earlier this year to rather greater fanfare than my slim offering. And it has already been called the most important economics book since Marx's Das Kapital. So, 700 pages long, it's a bit of an investment in time to read it. She defines surveillance capitalism as a new economic order that claims human experience as free raw material for hidden commercial practices of extraction, prediction, and sales. And there have been numerous examples of how human data collected under the auspices and banner of digital health have been monetized. It is the foundation of a surveillance economy, and we've already, those of you who know what's going on in China will be familiar with the kind of surveillance society that has built up there. And Shoshana Zuboff says that this is now the greatest challenge to democracy and human rights. Even during the golden age of medicine, some began to feel that medicine was losing its way. Among them was René Dubos, the great French-American microbiologist and writer. He argued in his 1959 book, Mirage of Health, that we had rather overinvested in medicine, and that solving problems of disease is not the same thing as creating health and happiness. The greatest critic of modern scientific medicine was an Austrian priest and philosopher called Ivan Illich. His 1975 polemic medical nemesis opened with the now famous phrase that the medical establishment has become a threat to health. He argued that through the medicalization of death, medicine had become a global pseudo-religion. Closer to home, Petr Scrabenick was a Czech-born doctor who spent most of his professional life at Trinity College's Department of Community Health. He died young in 1994. His book, The Death of Humane Medicine, was published a few months after his death. Scrabenick warned that medicine had overstepped its brief through screening and what he called coercive healthism. He wrote, "Medicine is not about conquering diseases and death, but about the alleviation of suffering, minimizing harm, and smoothing the painful journey of man to the grave." While we in the rich West continue to spend vast sums, for example, on cancer treatments, which often give meagre, incremental, attritional gains or no benefit at all, people in low-income countries die of diseases that can be cheaply cured or prevented. And they also die without adequate pain relief or palliative care. The Lancet published a commission in 2017 on alleviating the access abyss in palliative care. And this commission described how 25 million people every year, that's 45% of global deaths, 25 million people experience severe suffering at the end of life. Poor people throughout the world die without access to opiates or palliative care. And Richard Horton, the editor of The Lancet, wrote a powerful editorial when this commission report came out. And I'll read out what he wrote. "Medicine regards the alleviation of suffering as someone else's problem. Palliative care is too often seen as failure. The hubris of modern medicine is that it cannot face up to failure. The deification of biomedicine has created an anti-humanist and quasi-theocratic science of health." What's extraordinary about this statement is that it's incredibly radical, and yet it comes from The Lancet, one of the pillars of the medical establishment, a journal which, by the way, is owned by Elsevier. David Weatherall, many of you will be familiar with him, one of the great figures of British medicine, professor of medicine at Oxford, died last year. And he too felt that medicine had lost its way somehow. And he wrote a piece for the British Medical Journal in 1994. And in this piece he wrote that from the day that they decide on a career in medicine until the day they retire, doctors live and work in such an overcharged atmosphere where the demands are so great that they sometimes forget the central reason for what they're doing, the welfare of their patients. And this is the kind of overcharged atmosphere in which I work in the Irish Health Service. And I and many others, this is the sort of environment where I have to begin a post-take round. And this is the kind of environment where we are expected to be professional and humane. I've been surprised and, in fact, a little saddened that most of the heroes of my book and this talk are statisticians, not clinicians. This is Major Greenwood. He was Professor of Epidemiology and Statistics at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine from 1928 to 1946, and he was mentor to many, including Austin Bradford Hill. And you can trace an apostolic succession from Greenwood to Bradford Hill to Archie Cochrane to David Sackett to John Ioannidis. Major Greenwood gave a speech to the Royal Society of Arts in 1931, and he laid out the ethos of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. He said the ambition of the school should be to become the spiritual home of men and women, differing in race, education, and practical ambitions, but all aspiring to do their part to make the conditions of human life everywhere more bearable. So what is medicine for? Are we here to meet targets, to follow protocols and evidence-based guidelines? Is the purpose of research simply to generate data? Is clinical medicine now a service industry here to meet consumer demand? I think we should adopt Greenwood's rather humble aspiration to make the conditions of human life more bearable. And that is what I argue medicine is for. I'm going to finish by giving you a little follow-up story. This graduation photograph was taken in 1983. The man standing next to me is David Bristol, who is from the island of Grenada in the Caribbean. And he was the only non-Irish person in our graduating class. In fact, I was thinking on the way down, he was the only person who wasn't from Cork in the class. And he called around to me about 2 weeks ago, completely out of the blue. I hadn't seen him in years. And he, after graduation, trained as an orthopaedic surgeon in London. He went back to the Caribbean, to St. Lucia, where he worked for some time as a general and orthopaedic surgeon. But he gave it all up and is now essentially a businessman with interests in solar power and many other things throughout the Caribbean. As you can see, he's kept his hair. I've lost, as I say here, I had a head full of hair and a heart full of hope. I've lost the hair, certainly, but I still have a bit of the hope. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for downloading TopNet Talk. Don't forget to subscribe via your podcatcher. Don't forget to check us out on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And also, don't forget, TopMed Talk is the broadcasting arm of EBPOM, Evidence-Based Perioperative Medicine. We'd love you to find out more about that. If you check out ebpom.org, you can find low prices on some of the conferences we're organising around the world. Many of them are virtual and don't even involve you leaving your own home. Check out ebpom.org now.